Hi, and welcome to EdVantage. I'm Professor Marie Huntsinger, and today we're going to continue our conversation on race and ethnicity by discussing stereotypes, prejudice, discrimination, and racism. This can be a very hard topic to talk about because we have a lot of hard history and a lot of inequality that still exists today, but we need to be able to acknowledge it and talk about it in order to make a more equal and just world for tomorrow. So let's talk about some of the differences between these terms that are similar but have some key differences. Stereotypes are oversimplified generalizations about groups of people. Now, it's important to note that everyone's stereotypes. They're snapshot, quick judgments that form into our brain, and they get to our brains through a variety of ways, through our agents of socialization like the media, our families, or just past experiences. So an example of a stereotype would be, young people are always on their phones. Now, once we start taking that stereotype more seriously and we develop an entire attitude, or we judge a group before actually knowing a person in that group, that becomes prejudice. And this is more serious. This refers to beliefs, thoughts, feelings, and attitudes someone holds about a group. So for example, because I'm a professor and I teach a lot of young people, a prejudiced attitude could be based on a stereotype. Young people are always on their phones, and therefore I don't think they'll make good students. That would be a prejudicial attitude about young students, which, side note, I don't believe to be true. Unconscious biases or implicit biases may be a term that you've heard before. These are stereotypes about certain groups of people that individuals might not even know they have or are consciously aware of. So examples of implicit biases happen when we watch stereotypes being portrayed in the media or certain racial groups being portrayed a certain way, and they actually end up infiltrating our brains, and we form these biases without even knowing it, even though unconscious biases can have real life effects. There was a study done about white doctors who saw both Black patients and white patients with similar injuries, and the study found that the white doctors gave the Black patients less pain meds than the white patients. And the study concluded that was due to these unconscious biases. Discrimination is overt action. So you can have a prejudicial attitude and not discriminate. For example, if I owned a business and I had a prejudiced attitude against young people, I can choose not to act on that and still hold that prejudicial attitude. But once I decide that I'm not going to hire a qualified young person because of my prejudice, that is discrimination. Discrimination is overt and could involve things like segregation, which was institutional discrimination in the South under Jim Crow. Racism is a more serious form of prejudice used to justify a belief that one racial category is somehow superior or inferior to others. It's also used as a way for a racial majority to disadvantage a racial minority. Racism can be both individual and institutional. Institutional racism refers to the way that racism is embedded within society's institutions or structures. For example, the media, healthcare, education, the financial sector. White supremacy is beliefs and ideas purporting natural superiority of the lighter-skinned or white human races over other racial groups. So as we saw in the previous video with Linnaeus describing the European race as more favorable than other races, that would be an example of white supremacy. White supremacy ideology still exists today, even though it's more associated with extremist groups. It still leaves a lasting legacy. Individual racism can be seen in hate crimes or bias-motivated crimes based on a person's group membership. So we can see from this chart from the US Department of Justice that in 2017 and 2018, race, ethnicity, and ancestry bias was the #1 reason for a hate crime. Hate crimes is more based on the intention than the type of crime. So hate crimes can be both property crimes like vandalism or theft, and it can also be personal crimes like assault. Institutional racism has existed within society's institutions, especially common pre-civil rights movement. After the civil rights movement, we are all equal under the law. However, institutional racism still occurs what we call de facto. A 2012 study by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, also known as HUD, demonstrated that people of color were told about and shown fewer houses and apartments than whites. And we can see the consequences in home ownership. Black ownership is now at an all-time low at 42% compared to 72% for white folks. Now you may be asking, why is this a big deal? Well, a lot of your wealth comes from these big assets like home ownership, and wealth can be passed down from generation to generation. And so home ownership is one way for upward social mobility and to set up future generations for success. We can also see in the racial wealth gap quite a bit of difference between the household wealth between Black families, white families, and Hispanic families. Also, when we look at hourly earnings or income, white and Asian men typically earn the highest wages, and Black and Hispanic men and women typically earn the lowest wages. Much of the social issues of our time have been surrounded around issues in the criminal justice system regarding racial inequality. So for example, a study that was done by the ACLU found that Blacks and whites use marijuana at roughly equal rates. However, Blacks are about 4 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana. And there are some reasons behind that beyond just overt racism. For example, communities of color and poor communities tend to be more heavily policed than white suburban communities. However, racial profiling is a topic that has been given some attention. This occurs when law enforcement is suspicious of someone, not based on their individual actions, but just based on their social group membership. Okay, well, thank you for watching. I hope this video has helped, and tune in next time as we talk about theories of racism and anti-racism. Please click on the EdVantage logo to subscribe, and I'll see you next time.